take place on July 8th, co-organized with the Art Gallery of Ontario, and you can find a link that is being posted in the chat. So for the first item up on our agenda today, I'm going to invite Rawan Nabil and Tika Pinnock, who are PhD students in the Department of Political Science here at York University, to offer a lead acknowledgement.
Thank you. In the last few weeks, we have been reminded of the devastating impacts of colonialism and the residential school system on Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. Acknowledging the land on which we reside entreats us to acknowledge that settler colonialism does not exist in the past tense, but is a current ongoing process in which we're all implicated. We acknowledge the 751 Indigenous people, most of whom were children, who were murdered by the settler colonial state of KK Canada and were found in unmarked graves in a residential school or forced assimilation encampment in what is known as Saskatchewan. Overall, there have been 1,323 unmarked graves. We know there are more graves yet to be discovered because Indigenous elders have been telling us. What does it mean for us as settlers on these lands to acknowledge the violence inflicted on and the traumas experienced by Indigenous communities that are ever present in unmarked graves, missing and murdered women and girls, queer, trans, and two-spirit folks, colonial laws, unsafe drinking water, disinvestment in public systems, resource extraction, continued displacement and dispossession, and in monuments and names that simultaneously erase and repeat an injury done? What does it mean for us, for you, to engage in reconciliation and reparative praxis? In order to truly engage in reparations, the topic of today's lecture, we must work in joint struggle, recognizing the spatial and temporal connectivity between settler colonies in their dispossession and displacement of Indigenous populations across the globe. What does it mean to be in joint struggle with Indigenous communities on Turtle Island when you are forcibly exiled and displaced from your own home by the same forces that colonized these lands? What does it mean to actively work through visions and futures of collective liberation through struggle and resistance?
Today, we want to honor joint struggle with our Indigenous comrades, siblings, and friends who are currently in mourning. And we want to engage in land back acknowledgements, as Afro-Indigenous spoken word and performance artist Malika Aouri calls for. When we read out the traditional territories of these lands today, we are calling for land back to the holders and caretakers of these territories. Land back acknowledgements focuses on an unapologetic delivery that names the violence that has occurred and continues to occur in the creation of KKK Canada. We know that our struggles against settler colonialism are connected, and in the same ways, our resistance is collective. And we must engage in joint struggle in order to eradicate these systems that continue to perpetrate violence onto the peoples of these lands. And so, with acknowledging all of this, we want to honor the land that we are currently on, which is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Takaranto is covered by Treaty 13, which is signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, which is signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We also want to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This treaty is also subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. The dish with one spoon also means that we all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory, with only one spoon. That means that we have to share the responsibility of ensuring that the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of these lands and the creatures that we share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that we must keep the peace. We further acknowledge that there are broken covenants with Indigenous nations that we must all seek to repair. The land acknowledgement is only a small step in the direction of redress and reconciliation. We call on you to stand in solidarity with Indigenous nations. And we have a list of call to actions that you can also partake in. And I think they will be on the screen as well. So a couple of them are read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings and the Commission's call to action, and then find a way that you can support and fulfill those calls to action. Read the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Queer, Trans, and Two-Spirit Folks, and the 213 Calls for Justice. Take time to learn about the history and continuing experiences of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. Tear down all colonial statues. We call on institutions to decolonize. Indigenous scholarship and knowledge systems continue to be marginalized and erased in academia. And last but not least, we call on everybody to donate to the Indigenous-led organizations, in particular, the Indian Residential School Survival Society, which will also be linked below.
Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, this is still Indigenous land. It will always be Indigenous land. Indigenous people are not relics of the past. They are still here and will always be here. Indigenous resistance and resurgence lives on.
Thank you. I'll now draw your attention to our next speaker, who is Professor Greg Albo of the York University Department of Politics. Professor Albo is a major figure in international political economy and ecology, and he's a close collaborator and colleague of Leo Panitch, especially through his work on the Socialist Register. I will now ask Professor Albo to offer a tribute.
Thank you. The sudden death of Leo in December from COVID while he was in the hospital being treated for cancer was a shock to many of us at York and for critical social scientists and the left around the world. It is still difficult to believe for those of us who work with him closely at York that he's not here. Many of us were planning projects together with him into the fall, some for the next 2 years, some even for the next decade. It's still quite hard to grasp. Many of us will know something of Leo's writing and research over the years, his work on British Labour Party and incomes policy, on the Canadian state and coercion in the coercive turn in the regulation of labor, his analysis of the impasse of social democracy and the turn to the third way, of course, his great book with Sam Gindin on the making of global capitalism, and in the last decade, his various writings on the search for socialism and new political formations in parties and movements. Working collectively, Leo was at the center of many debates over the last several decades. One of the striking things about his research, his personality, his presence at York, was how central collaboration was to almost everything he did, helping found studies in political economy, his work with the Socialist Register. All his books were his major books were collaborations with figures like Donald Swartz, Colin Lee, Sam Gindin, and so on. Much of his political activism work were collaborations around different research groups, particularly around labor solidarity or research networks, building and developing analysis of new political parties and new political formations around the world. It was part of his kind of being was to collaborate. This was also Leo's approach to the university. He was, with his research chair, he was constantly organizing talks, workshops, assisting in the formation of research centers, and so on. Leo was fond of a quote from Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. I won't read it here, but the quote dealt with the decline of political science and the impoverishment of state theory, and the need to create a science of the capitalist state. This is something that he took as his own task, studying the contradictions and limits of liberal democracy and the limits of existing socialist organization and what might emerge out of those struggles in new forms. Part of this was also what he took, like Gramsci, was the terrain of the university. The university informing organic intellectuals of the working classes, bridging theoretical work with activist commitments into activist knowledges. This was something he actually kicked off in terms of the summer school 30 years ago as the kind of person who particularly initiated what was called then the International Political Economy Summer School, and now with ecology also inserted into it. It started with Steve Gill and Erica Leiner on globalization within political science, then quickly followed with a collaboration with the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Roger Collio, Kyle bringing Elmer Altweiler, Saskia Sassen, and many others in those first few years. And now we have a wide range of other faculty at York involved in the project in political science, in the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Geography, Anthropology, and so on. This initial collaboration was also across faculty and graduate students, also allowed us to work together on the project, the collaborative project, which was the Journal of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. Leo knew the initial founder of CNS, James O'Connor, well. Roger also knew him well. And we gathered for about a decade or more on a reading group around critical ecology issues, and particularly around the politics of eco-socialism becoming a reference point. The IPE summer school has proven to be an incredibly successful adventure. And I think being involved in it from almost the start, I've been particularly pleased that we've kept the frame that we initially began with. Leading international scholars, the most important topics of the day, activist and student participation, education for democracy, and so on. These were the themes that we began with. These are the themes that we particularly have with the presence of Robin Kelley. This year's, who's providing this year's intellectual feast for both faculty and students. There are few scholars in North America that match not only Robin's research contributions, but also his activist commitments to social justice against the inequalities of capitalist society. I only wish Leo was here to greet Robin himself, to debate with Robin, and probably also to go back and forth a bit about Monk and the mutual love of jazz and Monk. So thank you all for kind of listening to me. You'll have a great lecture from Robin. I've enjoyed so many of his lectures on video. I wish we were able to gather together to hear it as well, and particularly also with Leo's presence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now draw your attention to Professor Pablo Idahosa. Professor Idahosa is from York University's Department of Social Sciences, and he's the former director and continual champion of African Studies at York University. Professor Idahosa is going to be introducing Professor Kelley.
Thank you so much. It's the, good evening, everybody. It's a usual ritual to say it's a privilege and an honor to be introducing somebody as extraordinary as Robin D.G. Kelley. He wears his learning lightly, even though his learning is extraordinarily wide and deep. I just want to tell a quick anecdote quickly. At a recent history hire, one of my colleagues in history said of Robin that he is America's greatest historian. He might blush at this because I know he has a certain degree of modesty, but at the same time, it speaks to not just his voluminity and the range of the many things that he does, but it's also, in a sense, the ways in which he's undertaken very, very difficult research, his classical research on the hoe and the hammer, for example, looking at Black communists in Alabama in the 1930s. There's an extraordinary work, original work, that's recently been reissued. And in so many ways, what has characterized Robin's work over the last 30 years has been really three things, I think. One is the concern about ordinary people and looking at the way in which ordinary people, in a sense, draw upon their own struggles as a way of establishing their own discourses, their own ways of understanding the structures of racial capital in the context, particularly in the context of the United States. The second is the intergenerational nature of the struggles that people undertake and undergo, not just in one place in the United States, but also globally. It's no accident that Robin has has given a number of forwards to a number of key thinkers in a particular tradition that I'll mention in a moment that many of you are familiar with. People from Aimé Césaire to C.L.R. James, amongst many, many others that he's drawn upon to identify, in a sense, a particular kind of tradition that in many ways historically has been marginalized or has only been known by people who study this, but who in some ways have been absolutely central to the founding of our understanding of both the modern world and particularly modern capital, and in the particular way, racialized capitalism. So it's a combination of his unearthing of the struggles of people, particularly African Americans, but also Africans globally and worldwide. I want to quote something from his classic, even though it's a few years old, but tremendous book on Thelonious Monk, where he quotes at the end of a funeral to Monk something along the lines of where a car breaks down. One of Monk's children makes the point about those who will be first will be last, essentially. Those who are at the back of the line will go first. Those who are at the front of the line will go to the back. And Robin's coda to that is that characterizes in so many ways Monk's life, about someone who wasn't recognized, someone who in some senses was expropriated, and someone who had to struggle deeply for that recognition. It seems to me that so much of Robin's work is about that understanding that ordinary people today seek to draw upon and establish for themselves. And so when I talk about the intergenerationality of his work, it's both an unearthing for younger people to rediscover the past of a particular kind of tradition. And that's, of course, the Black radical tradition that was first generated by a number of different people, but not least of all, of course, Cedric Roberts. And to bring these up to date. So he also has his finger on the pulse of a great deal of popular culture. Popular culture in the sense, of course, music, but additionally, popular culture in the sense of, once again, the everyday struggles against racism, against racial capital, and against the injustices that characterize capitalism. The final thing, and this gets back to the issue of the unearthing, of trying to look at that tradition in a sense to recenter, to re-understand how we understand modern struggles today, and recentering the importance of how racialized capitalism is so central, not marginal, to the accumulation of power and wealth, and therefore its overcoming. With this in mind, I'd like to introduce Professor Robert D. Kelley, who is going to be talking about on reparations and decolonization, a more apt title for the present conjuncture that we're currently in. Thank you.
Oh boy, thank you, Pablo. I'm so embarrassed by the introduction. I shrunk 2 inches. So I used to be 5'8", so I'm like 5'6", just shrunk. So I'll see if I can just get over it. I'm so embarrassed, but that's so nice of you. It's also great to hear Greg Upple's words about Leo Panitch, who I met a couple times, and in fact, his book with Sam Gindin, The Making of Global Capitalism, is something I've used in my undergraduate course. So I've sold like 400 copies of that book, by the way, and students struggled with it and learned a lot. So I really appreciate that. Okay, so let me just begin. First, let me just begin by saying I'm speaking to you. I'm not in Canada. I'm here in Los Angeles, which is known as unceded territory of the Tongva and Chumash people. And I want to, before I do anything, thank Professors Honor Ford Smith and Anna Zalik for inviting me to help teach the IPE's seminar, and for doing so much work to accommodate my disorganized self, to Alyssa Trotz for making a connection, and just for being your brilliant self. So, I didn't realize how much work would be involved. So I'm not saying you owe me anything, but that was, but I'm working my butt off, but not as hard as the students. And I just want to also acknowledge how amazing the students are in the seminar, and I've learned so much, and hopefully this talk will reflect some of that learning. And speaking of students, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my support for the Canadian Union of Public Employees Local 3903, Units 1, 2, and 3, which is made up of teaching assistants, contract faculty, and graduate assistants who are trying in negotiating in good faith for a contract and a safe return to in-person work on campus. And I trust that the university will reconsider its plans for a lockout. And if not, I do really support the workers' right to strike and support giving them a very strong mandate. Because, you know, one of the things I'm going to talk about is what does it mean to decolonize a university, or specifically, what does reparations mean within the university context, among many other things. So I just want to give that shout out and just say, lend my support. I don't cross picket lines, never have. Okay, so let me begin by just with an apology. So this is a less than formal lecture. It's more thinking out loud about a number of issues. So my remarks will be provisional, incomplete, sometimes coherent. I'm staring at a whole bunch of notes and I'm going to make sense of them. I have this bad habit of coming up with titles of things without a talk and then, you know, trying to put together a talk when I realized that the title was way too ambitious. But let me try to do the best I can. Clearly, the context for my thinking on these twin but related issues of reparations and decolonization is what was brought up in the beautiful land acknowledgement at the beginning, and that is the discovery of more bodies, mainly children, in this ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples. It's not a new story. You know, of course, you know, many of you could read Volume 4 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada about these grave sites and the boarding schools and the impact. Of course, it cuts across boundaries. We have very similar forms of genocide here, and the history is gruesome. The other context, of course, is the heightened conversation about reparations in the Caribbean, in the United States, and certainly here in Canada, or there in Canada. And after the public lynching of George Floyd, which of course wasn't the only death, there's many, many deaths, of course, there in Canada just weeks before George Floyd. But George Floyd's murder was a kind of world historical event, whose impact is not just limited to North America, but there's a direct link between this kind of reparations talk, specifically around racial justice and anti-Black racism, and the protests around George Floyd. Let me just be clear. It's not the murder of George Floyd, but the protests that brought this to light. Murders happen all the time. And so what happens? I mean, we see, for example, the impending passage of H.R. 40 here in the United States, introduced into the U.S. Congress to establish a commission to study reparations. This is a piece of legislation that John Conyers brought forward on the floor back in 1989, so it's been around for a while. We see the creation of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the lawsuit against the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma for the 1921 massacre. And this, of course, was the centennial year for that, commemorating that massacre. We see the reparations experiment in Evanston, Illinois. I'll say a bit about that toward the end. And of course, there's growing support for the Caribbean reparations movement organized by CARICOM. And there are other things around the globe. Belgium established a commission just last year to look into the crimes in the Congo under King Leopold in the Belgian state, as well as crimes in Burundi and Rwanda. And this was, just last year. Also in 2020, the European Parliament declared slavery a crime against humanity. A little late there, but what it is. Of course, France declared slavery a crime against humanity 20 years ago, but when Haitians demanded reparations, or at the very least, a return of the indemnity they were forced to pay France, France said no. Then they helped overthrow President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and then issued a report authored by one-time hero of third world liberation struggles, Regis Debray, on the folly of reparations claims by Haiti. And yet, just in 2019, France established a foundation to create a museum and memorials regarding the role played by France in the trade of enslaved Africans. I won't talk about Algeria and its silence on that, but that's, maybe something will come up. Also in 2020, Argentina launched the National Commission for the Historical Recognition of the Afro-Argentine Community, which also called for some sort of reparations. Colombia launched its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2020 on the impact of the armed conflict on people of African descent. And of course, just yesterday, the UN Human Rights Council released its report on human rights violations by law enforcement. And the report itself is limited to Africans and people of African descent. And as we know, it was also prompted by the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. That document, though it's only 23 pages, it calls for some kind of reparations and an entire transformative agenda aimed at reversing what it identifies as cultures of denial, dismantling systemic racism, holding law enforcement accountable for human rights violations, protecting protesters, and then here's the key, acknowledging and confronting legacies of racial injustice through accountability and redress. Now, the report, interestingly enough, directs its recommendations almost entirely to what states should do. Never acknowledging that these states are often, if not primarily, the source of state violence, right? The document reads, states should seize opportunities to advance the anti-racism agenda, prioritize attaining racial equity, etc., which is interesting in light of the fact that, say, in Nigeria, for example, Nigerian people's struggles against SARS is a struggle against state violence, let alone struggles against state violence in Canada, in the United States, in Brazil, South Africa. We can go on and on and on. Ultimately, what I want to try to do this evening is just think out loud about what it means to link ongoing Indigenous genocide with histories of slavery, and by the way, sparked by contemporary police killings and other murders that are being piled up. And the context is important because in one sense, there's a kind of catalyst that unfortunately reinforces our obsession with death. In other words, there's always a body count. Black and Indigenous death becomes the obscene means by which our lives are recognized and valued. And I don't use obscene lightly because just a few days ago, if you watch the news, an avowed white supremacist murdered a black man and a black woman outside of Boston. And the press accounts, once again, emphasize that the victims did not deserve to die, as if that should be said. Because they were good people. One was a retired military officer, the other retired cop, both in their 60s. They both, they had children, they were respectable. And so this is the discourse we are still saddled with. So I don't want to, in thinking about these things together, participate in the kind of theoretical trafficking in Black and Indigenous death. My sort of investigation, meditation, critique of the state of the reparations debate and the need to embrace a decolonial future is really about life. It's not about death. It's about imagining the afterlife of decolonization. And like many others, like your brilliant colleague, Andrea Davis, and certainly Tiffany Lethabo King and others, I want to bring together these two different conversations, the conversation about decolonization and the land back movement, and the movement for reparations, which is the primary focus this evening because of time. too often they're talked about separately and limited to national boundaries, and that's the other problem. And you know, if we limit the discussion of decolonization reparations to within national boundaries, it kind of makes no historical sense whatsoever, since dispossession, extraction, genocide occurred before these modern nations even came into being. They were part of a broader empire, imperial expansion. And in fact, even after those nations come into being, these modern nation states, dispossession, extraction, genocide exceeds these boundaries. So talk about decolonization in North America is certainly not a new thing, but it has moved center stage thanks to indigenous struggles such as Idle No More, the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline, NODAPL, the current struggles taking place as we speak against the Enbridge Pipeline, struggles against sexual violence and serial murder of Native women and girls, cis and trans and queer people, as was mentioned in the land acknowledgement. And just as Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives and the kind of insurgencies that really, have the roots in the 90s but take off after 2013, and the ongoing struggles against racialized state violence led to a growing interest in the Black radical tradition, in critiques of racial capitalism and radical scholarship. Indigenous movements have renewed interest in indigenous critique, which has increasingly become a more radical alternative or supplement to more traditional orthodox Marxism and anarchist critiques. Okay, I know I'll get myself in trouble for saying that, but I'm ready to debate if you want. Okay, so in revisiting my chapter in Freedom Dreams, titled A Day of Reckoning, Dreams of Reparations, which is sort of what I'm trying to do. That chapter in reparations was written like 20 years ago. And it's not the one that people talk much about, which is interesting, but nevertheless. And the absence of indigenous critique in that chapter, one of my failings, many failings, is really striking. So to acknowledge the inseparability of dispossession, genocide, and slavery in upholding the settler colonial regime and its ongoing policies of extraction is also to think about decolonization alongside reparations. So decolonization begs the question, what is required to reverse 500 plus years of history and make a new world? How can we think of reparations and decolonization as complementary processes rather than at odds? And that's not an easy kind of self-evident assertion, because there are countervailing claims and erasures. Native erasure in reparations claims, for example, with some exceptions. There's a tendency to collapse all non-native peoples into the category of settlers, including indigenous peoples kidnapped from Africa and forced to labor here. And in the U.S. territory, there's a really fraught, complicated relationship created by the exceptional cases of indigenous slave ownership of Africans, of blood quantum protocols imposed by the state, and the denial of Afro-Indigenous peoples of tribal recognition, which has more to do with ongoing colonial relationships. This is not the fault of indigenous people, but ongoing colonial relationships in which the settler state is empowered to distribute benefits, control land, and reparations in terms of indigenous peoples is not really the question as much as the return of land back, which is much bigger than trying to put a price tag on something. In other words, it's not like you can buy off this genocidal violence. But no matter what, no matter how fraught, no matter how difficult, how complex these relationships are, we don't really have a choice if we're going to end the catastrophe of heteropatriarchal racial capitalism. So going back to that chapter I wrote, the one thing I do stand by as my initial stance toward reparations, which insists that we really ought to think about reparations or the reparations campaign as a social movement. As such, it was never entirely or primarily about money. The demand for reparations was about social justice, reconciliation, reconstructing our lives as a people, and ending all forms of racism and exploitation. And this is why, reparations proposals from Black radical movements that I write about focus not on individual payments, but on securing funds to build Black institutions, and in some cases, establishing a homeland of sorts. They imagine a kind of new set of economic and social arrangements geared toward collective needs in a caring culture rather than accumulation. Unfortunately, that is not the discourse that's taken place, certainly on this side of this artificial border. Much of the current discourse or plans for reparations here in the US, at least, do not challenge the terms of racial capitalism. They don't challenge its logic. Its logic is firmly rooted in property rights, in documentation, in compensation, which is what you're really talking about, compensation as opposed to reparations, without any real transformation. And much of the discourse, the popular discourse around it, continues to exclude Indigenous dispossession. One of the huge exceptions, of course, is the Caribbean reparations movement, which I'll say a little bit about near the end, but it's one that at least acknowledges Indigenous dispossession and genocide as part of the demand for reparations, which is not necessarily the case in some of the more popular texts you see floating around, like William Darity and book on, which is a very popular book right now, and others. In any case, what has disturbed me most is the incredibly parochial way in which reparations is discussed, and the most prominent proponents frame reparations entirely within, again, the capitalist political economy. Payments are calculated according to capitalist principles. Outcomes are even seen as strengthening capitalism, as if this is a good thing, making it more fair and less, quote unquote, racial, and creating an even playing field so we can all compete together. Value is literally determined by the market. But we need to be clear. If we accept capitalism as normative, as a legitimate system to organize and govern our lives, then there is no case for reparations. There's no legitimate case that can be made. Because what this is, everything that people are asking for compensation for is capitalism. In other words, this is what racial capitalism is. It is a system, an ideology that assigns differential value to human life and labor through land enclosure, slavery, dispossession, displacement, predatory lending, taxation, disfranchisement, looting, through terror and government policies that engage in wage theft or suppress Black, Brown, and Indigenous wages, relieves us of property, excluded Black people from better schools, and Indigenous people, forcing them into schools engaged in forms of cultural genocide as well as physical genocide, suppress home values based on race, and subsidizes white wealth accumulation. So all the things, again, that we're demanding, asking in a kind of more liberal notions of reparations, slavery, dispossession, genocide, are technically legal. Were technically legal at the time, and the consequences of capital accumulation. And in fact, they were happening in Europe. The use of galley slaves, to enclosure acts, to the creation of the workhouse. These are fundamental forms of unfreedom and violence that were considered legal, justifiable, and liberal. These acts were not against law or even liberalism. They were sanctioned by liberalism and expanded after the bourgeois democratic revolutions that brought us constitutional republics based on abstract notions of liberty and freedom. So while we can all agree that, today, and Europe apparently just figured that out, that slavery was a crime against humanity, humanity, the actual kidnapping and imprisonment of Africa's indigenous peoples, as well as indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, which we have to acknowledge. It's not as if there's no slavery of indigenous peoples, lots of slavery throughout the hemisphere. And not only that, but a slave trade in which indigenous peoples in the Carolinas, for example, were enslaved and placed on boats and taken to Barbados, into Jamaica and places like that. But in any case, all of this was sanctioned by law, regimes of international law, regimes that we rely on to press the case for reparations. So, to go back to slavery again, there was no ready-made slave market. Human beings, with no intention of becoming enslaved people, were enslaved through warfare, banditry, sometimes debt, and outright kidnapping. So we call it slavery, but this is imprisonment. It's not servitude. Africans became chattel once captured and sold, and which is why, in 1668, Barbados established, quote, an act declaring the Negro slaves of this land to be real estates, property. Liberalism, therefore, did not conflict with slavery. It was the basis upon which the legal regime of slavery was built. Now, the U.S. Constitution, like all modern constitutions produced by the bourgeois democratic revolutions of the time, was designed to protect private property and define liberty in terms of one's ability to control and dispose of property. So if Africans are real estates, they're property. And we see this in the U.S. Constitution with the Fifth Amendment declaring that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it's precisely that amendment that protected slaveholders, not enslaved people. Enslaved Africans were property. And government-imposed abolition violated property rights, okay? Which is why when the British Empire abolished slavery in 1834, the Crown paid compensation to owners, not the kidnapped, to the tune of 20 million pounds, which, according to scholars like the great Vereen Shepherd, is calculated to be something like 12 billion pounds today. Likewise, during the Civil War in the United States, the federal government paid compensation to slaveholders in the loyal border states and in Washington, D.C. This is why Haiti was forced to make reparations to French slaveholders in 1825, which turned out to be worth, in 2004 dollars, like $21 billion, right? And there's a whole story around that. They basically kind of bankrupted the Haitian treasury. French banks arranged loans, which kept its future mortgage to bankers who made enormous amounts of money on the interest and debt service. The debt was paid off in 1893 finally, but the damage was done, and Haiti could not be the same, or the potential was arrested. Now, this is not to say, and here's a little bit of a detour, that all European intellectuals and political figures agreed on this kind of liberal regime of slavery and dispossession. This is why you had the levelers and the diggers and figures like Marquis de Condorcet, whose book Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind, published in 1795, called for the abolition of slavery, the end of imperialism, the ending of inequality between and within nations, and ending, in his words, our murderous contempt for men of another color or creed, and the full equality between the sexes. The levelers and the Condorcets, as we know, basically were defeated. And it didn't have to be that way. I mean, Europe's architects of the colonial capitalist racial order had alternatives, and their sharpest critics to the emerging bourgeois democratic racial capitalist order were in fact the very people they subjugated and dispossessed and enslaved. So during the 17th century, when the regime was taking off and beginning to take shape, indigenous intellectuals like Kandiaronk of the Wendat Nation and members of the Mi'kmaq Nation debated French Jesuits in the 17th century, debates that were captured in many of the popular European texts at the time, like Lahotan's conversations with Kandiaronk, where, he, in conversations, excoriated European society for using punishment to force people to do good, for turning land, resources, and people into property, and for being obsessed with money, which just did not make any sense in an Indigenous critique. To quote Kandiaronk, he says, "I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and I still can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman. And I genuinely think this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions of mine and thine. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls and slaughterhouse of the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake." In any case, and by the way, there's a really interesting book that's about to come out that talks about Indigenous critique of European society, among other things, which is a kind of rethinking of ancient history by Dave Wengro and David Graeber before he passed away. In any case, although he enters the scene much later, the same could be said of intellectuals like Ottobah Cugoano, the kidnapped West African who was enslaved and who eventually won his freedom and published a dissertation in 1787 titled "Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species." Now, I give these examples because I want to suggest that there were many interlocutors, not just in Turtle Island with European colonizers and missionaries who were colonizers, but also on the shores of West and Central Africa. And we know nothing about them. But my point is twofold. First, elements of Western democratic thought and even ideas about freedom were often taken from indigenous thinkers. I mean, there would be no U.S. Constitution without the Iroquois. Though the best parts, of course, were clearly discarded or defeated in favor of property. I mean, it's clear that Rousseau, for example, his famous essay on discourse on inequality, relied heavily on accounts of indigenous thought, though he did ultimately acknowledge that private property is something which may be terrible, but it was inevitable, and that's not necessarily the case. Second, settler colonialism not only took land and stole people and tried to eliminate indigenous people here, but entire political and social structures that offered a different path for the earth and all of life were destroyed, not entirely, but partly destroyed in ways, and certainly assaulted, suppressed, and arrested. And this is the story of Africa during what some critics call the Mafa, or the catastrophe. That is, by destroying local forms of governance, by destroying early communism, the so-called slave trade, the Mafa, set in motion the mechanisms of outright genocide on the continent. And I would go further and suggest that the architecture of colonial governance was established not in the 19th century, but in the moment of the early formation of the trade in human beings. This is hinted at by Walter Rodney, certainly by Bamdani and Chinwezu. All suggest that the architecture is there from the get-go. So we make this grave error in some of the greatest intellectuals and thinkers and theorists whose work I still don't understand, but I know they're really smart, keep coming back to seeing African complicity in the slave and colonial regimes as somehow agency which obscures the process of social destruction. So here, though I'm not going to make the case in any detail, there's a case to be made for African reparations without having to go into this whole, gymnastics about, well, Africans were complicit because we sold ourselves, we sold each other. The structures that would have resisted that were destroyed in the process and replaced by something else, by mechanisms that actually facilitated this human trafficking. And more importantly, the places where it didn't exist had to be crushed. And this another story way beyond the scope. But having said that, let me just make another turn and talk about what does it mean to think about colonialism and reparations. Clearly, obviously, reparations is not just about slavery, and we all know that, and Freedom Dreams makes that point. But let me just make a couple of interventions here. So W.E.B. Du Bois had insisted at the very birth of the United Nations, during the talks at Dumbarton Oaks in 1944, that colonialism ought to be declared a crime against humanity. And he argued that the UN's mandate must include decolonization, protecting human rights, which was the discourse was emerging at the time, and ensuring the principles of the Atlantic Charter of 1941 applied to all people, irrespective of where they are. And of course, for many reasons, this didn't happen. One reason, obviously, is that the UN was designed to only recognize nations and not peoples. So attacking colonialism, much like attacking slavery, was considered an assault on the sovereignty of colonizing nations, like attacking slavery would be assault on private property. So if sovereignty meant the right of nations to colonize other nations, then the colonizing nations don't have nation status, right? So therefore, they're not recognized. And so Du Bois kept saying, he's not the only one, obviously, but he's most famous. So there's that factor of not recognizing peoples that are not necessarily nation states recognized by the settler colonial regime. And the other thing is that preserving the Anglo-American alliance was far more important than the plight of 750 million people in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. So of course, this temporarily foreclosed the possibility of paying reparations. And we've had some recent moves. The Herrero sought reparations from Germany for colonial policies that of genocide in 1904, 1907. Germany offered $11.7 million. Namibia rejected it. And I think there's a more recent a settlement that's taken place. But again, the fact that we're talking about 21st century and there's still discussions about reparations for colonialism. The contemporary reparations debate in the U.S., I have a lot of notes on that, but I'm going to skip over some of it. I'll just say a couple of things. Tulsa has been in the news lately, and one of the really disappointing things about the way that the discourse around the violence against Tulsa, the massacre in Tulsa, and the destruction of so-called Black Wall Street, is that the focus has been not on just the numbers of people killed, but property destroyed. And this obsession with Black Wall Street, when we're talking about 40 square blocks of property in people's lives were just bombed. And my question always is, why do we keep going back to the loss of property by the wealthiest Black people in Tulsa, by talking about how they could have been the next Hilton, the hotel owner, or how this particular person owned all these beautiful homes. They were also renters, and some were slumlords renting to Black working class people in other parts of the Greenwood area. But more importantly, my question always is, what's worth more, the price of a hotel, or the life of a hotel worker? And that, to me, raises a lot of questions about the way we think about the continual use of traditional mathematics to determine value. And that's just one example. So in other words, when we think about reparations, are we thinking about, a transfer of wealth that would ultimately lead to the creation of a new class of Black entrepreneurs, startup capital, new businesses? What will really change if capitalism remains the same? Okay, let's see. I'm going to skip over this. well, no, I'm not. Let me just say one other thing before I get to the last section, and that is that I keep returning back to strategies, proposals for reparations that were so powerful, like the Black Manifesto in 1969, which wasn't asking for a lot of money. It was actually a pittance. It was like basically $500 million. But it was the way that they imagined the distribution of those funds. That is $200 million for the Southern Land Bank, $20 million for National Black Labor Strike Fund. That is to say, money to set aside for struggle, money, $10 million for the National Welfare Rights Organization to fight, money to build research skills centers and, communications networks, and $130 million to be used to establish a Black university in the South, and also $20 million to use to support, to provide material aid for African liberation movements, that sort of thing. It's a different way of thinking about reparations. Okay, I'm gonna skip over that. So the Caribbean reparations movement, very briefly, through CARICOM, the CARICOM Reparations Justice Program, is unique in that it is one of the few that really treats reparations as a project for Africans and Indigenous peoples. And it proposes a 10-point plan, which includes a full formal apology, repatriation, or the right to return, of African people to return with funds for resettlement, Indigenous peoples development plan, which it isn't much there yet, but besides a scholarship for University of West Indies, but they're still waiting for further plans. But I think that acknowledgement is the beginning of how do you try to not repair, certainly, redress somehow Indigenous genocide. Investments in building cultural institutions, addressing public health crises, eradicating illiteracy, African knowledge program, programs to address with healing and trauma and repair, technology transfer, which is something that the king of the Congo had been begging for in the midst of the slave trade in the 16th century, a technology transfer from Portugal, but they didn't go for that. And finally, debt cancellation. Natasha Lightfoot, a brilliant scholar, gave a talk there recently, which raised a number of really important points, which included the need to address sexual violence and the devaluation of Black women's bodies, and the ongoing colonial laws targeting queer and gender nonconforming people, which is an issue that Alyssa Trotz also works on. But a point I want to highlight here in terms of the CARICOM project is, again, how do we understand reparations projects that focus on the state? What are the limits of state control, or states as the arbiters of some kind of reparations payment? As we'll get to, decolonization is a different move out of that. But nevertheless, it's something to think about, because if you think about, it's a very different example, but I was thinking about what it meant when Germany, as a result of its own kind of truncated truth and reconciliation process of the Nuremberg trials, gave $58 billion to Israel to help start a nation in the name of reparations. But what did that produce? In the name of reparations for the Holocaust, it literally provided startup capital for a new settler colonial state. So we have to ask the question about what does truth and reconciliation really mean? If you are supposed to produce a better history alongside compensation and begin to heal wounds, but what does it mean when payments meant to compensate for violent dispossession of Polish people, of the outright theft of property and incarceration and mass murders of Jews, and then help fund the dispossession of Palestinians, outright theft of their property, occupation of their lands under aggressive lethal military rule? And then we could turn to universities. There's two ways in which universities are popularly discussed in terms of reparations and decolonization. Certainly Georgetown University is a very famous example where they're giving these really paltry payments to descendants, but only descendants. If you got to prove you're a descendant of a slave who was on Georgetown's campus. Land acknowledgements, which we always begin with, are complicated. This particular land acknowledgement was important because it actually acknowledged that it's not enough to recognize, but to actually give the land back. And so we have to be careful about the way that universities use land acknowledgements as a way of advancing what Glenn Coulthard calls the politics of recognition and reproducing an ongoing colonial order. So we shouldn't be surprised when maybe a few years from now, Israeli universities will include land acknowledgements of Palestinians who are dispossessed, even to the point of saying formally called Palestine, and settler colonialism continues. And there's other examples of universities. We have recently Princeton University that had the bones of children who were killed in the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, used for experimentation and study. Universities and land acquisition, displacement and gentrification of whole communities, mostly working class, poor, often black, brown, and certainly indigenous communities as well. Finally, there's ongoing racism. There at York University, you have the case of M.A. Avalanto, who has been suffering for years under direct anti-black racism, and there's an attempt on the part of York University to fire him. So I think that's something to pay attention to. And there's lots of examples. So what does decolonized university mean? What does reparations mean when, for example, social and medical sciences are oriented toward sustaining neoliberal capitalism in the colonial order? And what good are sort of all these faculty lines that are being thrown at us now after the protests around the murder of George Floyd, or creating Indigenous studies departments in providing yearly reparations payments to descendants of slaves, if the university doesn't change, if it still is playing this role in the reproduction of racial capitalism. I'm not going to talk about Evanston. That's a very complicated thing. All I could say, though, is that if you've been paying attention, the city of Evanston has this historic proposal to distribute $10 million to black residents for reparations for housing discrimination. But my question always is this about building black wealth for individual homeowners under a capitalist system? And what does it mean to secure black property ownership on stolen land? What does it mean to secure black ownership and you still have racialized property values? How do you address the fact that the same housing stock and land is valued less because black people live there? I mean, there's lots of problems with this idea of reparations by basically providing money for black people to buy homes. I'm all for, people having things. That's great, but there's much that we have to sort of think about as well. Okay. I'm running out of time here, although we started late, so I'm not going over too much. The last two things I want to do is talk about decolonization, but I want to talk about the problem of repair and healing, and then give 9 theses on decolonization. So repair is sort of the shorthand sort of outcome, right, of reparations, supposedly. So we talk about repair and healing, but repair and healing under a kind of liberal decolonization vision, tends to make amends without ending the structure of settler colonialism. And in fact, indigenous activists warn us against this. In the book Red Nation Rising, they list as a settler scam peace and healing. So what does it mean to take up peace and healing as part of the struggle for Native liberation? they ask, how might we revise our understanding of peace and healing to imagine a world that prioritizes collective well-being and healthy relationships? So they clearly recognize trauma as the condition produced by colonialism, but a kind of neoliberalism, under neoliberalism, trauma has been turned into kind of new age therapeutic politics. And we see this, the potential for this, even in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, where you have a therapeutic language of trauma and healing, which can often, not always, potentially substitute for actual redress. And it's one of the things that happens. And just to quote, they point out that the reconciliation in the language of trauma to neutralize Native demands for decolonization, although less insidious, historical trauma individualizes and personalizes colonialism, focusing on its victims rather than dismantling colonialism itself. And it's a trick of settler societies to defer Native liberation. Okay, finally, in conclusion, I just want to present 9 brief theses about decolonization and what it means. Because in some ways, decolonization is, if reparations is a way of trying to create redress, it certainly can't take place under the current racial capitalist and settler colonial arrangements. Otherwise, it reproduces those arrangements ultimately. If there's a way in which reparations can undermine those arrangements, weaken them, that's another thing. And that's what some of the reparations movements as social movements have been trying to do. But let's talk about decolonization. So settler colonialism, of course, is a system, this is Thesis 1, designed for wealth extraction. Besides extraction, it's the elimination of indigenous peoples. But because these were modern capitalist societies often driven by ideas of sovereignty, freedom, independence, the process of dispossession required legitimizing settler sovereignty over both land and people. So it really is impossible to unsettle and dismantle colonialism without dismantling capitalism. And that's something I think that everyone agrees on. A second thesis is that the question of land is still fundamental to decolonization. Free the land has been a common greeting and slogan among certain Black nationalists, like the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, for decades, is it speaks not only to the centrality of land for decolonization, but to a vision of freedom that's not based on ownership or possession or anthropocentrism. The land has been enslaved and needs liberation so the earth could flourish, so people could flourish, so the historical and contemporary structures of violence might end, opening up a radically different future which is not based on private property. In other words, we're talking about decolonizing not just people, but life itself, the entire planet. And this is why indigenous people have been at the forefront of struggles against pipelines and fracking and fossil fuel extraction and environmental racism. Thesis 3, the question of land is important because dispossession is not just about property, it is spiritual theft, a disruption of history in our relationship with the ancestors who still occupy this land. So as long as we treat land as property, that is, with legal ownership and borders and boundaries to be policed and surveilled and surveyed, or think of ourselves as owners rather than caretakers and protectors, or people who we defer to as caretakers and protectors of land and resources, we can't begin to think about reparations, let alone decolonization. Decolonization, Thesis 4, decolonization requires the abolition of all forms of oppression and violence. It means real abolition, that is, disbanding the military, the police, prisons, opening borders, freeing the body from the constraints of inherited and imposed normativities of gender and sexuality, the liberation of LGBTQ, two-spirit peoples. This is all central to the struggle for decolonization. And it's about ending what might be the oldest war of all wars, and that's the war on women's bodies, cisgender, trans, femmes, the war that takes the form of control over reproduction, over mobility, and uses sexual violence and reduces bodies to property. Thesis 5, self-determination for all oppressed nations is a fundamental principle of decolonization. Of course, for Indigenous peoples, treaties are still in place and are being violated on a daily basis, which says something about the nation state that claimed to bring law and order to the so-called native, to Indigenous people, but instead brought unprecedented lawlessness. And that's one of the ironies. However, genuine self-determination is impossible given the current structures of governance and relations of economic dependence. So we too often think of self-determination as modern nations operating on the basis of representative democracies and constitutions rather than restoring more democratic forms of governance, consensus and participatory models that often prevail before invasion. Thesis 6, we have to decolonize history. And obviously this is linked to decolonizing thought, to ending epistemic violence, education, etc. But for our purposes, I just want to draw attention to how we think about the past, even question the extent to which it is past. It's not enough to shift perspective from colonizer to colonized, to simply recast discovery as invasion, since it can still fall prey to teleology, to notions of progress, to stadio theories of history, which we're still shackled with, the idea of stages in history. And history is bounded within nation states. And there's much more to say about that, but I'm going to skip over this. But I do want to say this, though, is that decolonizing history also means decolonizing time. And I want to encourage us to rethink our conception of time, away from linear time and teleology, away from eschatological time, and consider indigenous conceptions of time. And I want to suggest an affinity with what I and others have called blues time, or blues temporality. Amir Baraka once wrote that the blues is deeper and older than itself as this self. And this is not about the history of origins of the blues, but rather how the blues as an expression of Black life and philosophy conceives of time. Blues time stretches, it's flexible, it's improvisatory, it's simultaneously in the moment, in the past, in the future, and the timeless space of the imagination. In the blues, and again, Baraka reminds us, quote, the past is also the future. What is nigh is coming, Eve before am. The present was here before it was the past, and after it was the future. So blues time, is, like certain forms of indigenous time, is closer to what we could think of as generative temporality. And I'm not going to talk much about this, but I will say that generative temporality recognizes the future itself as indeterminate, as full of contingencies. It's not always prefigurative. And by thinking of political practice as generative rather than prefigurative, the future is not only uncertain, but the road is constantly changing, along with new social relations, requiring new visions and exposing new contradictions and challenges. And since there's little reassurance that a liberated future is on the horizon, struggle is required to interrupt historical processes leading to catastrophe. And this is the lesson that Amilcar Cabral taught us by insisting that colonialism interrupted the historical development of African peoples, and the struggle for liberation in turn will interrupt the catastrophe unleashed by colonial exploitation, extraction, and subjugation. Thesis 7, the liberal democratic state is incapable of decolonization. Rather than establish an ethical and just polity in which all people are accorded status as humans and sovereignty and the commons are respected, the liberal democratic state has been the engine of ongoing colonial domination and capitalist exploitation. So this should not be a startling statement, but it's noteworthy how often movements sought to restore forms of law and order that could bring the colonizer to justice, to actually recognize and hold settler colonists or the regime accountable for crimes against humanity. So we continue to turn to the very state apparatus, the crime weapon, to appeal for justice. And I think indigenous movements have pointed to other means, turned to other non-U.S. authority, customary law and practice, and sometimes armed struggle, as any sovereign nation would do. The last two, Thesis 8, decolonization is not an event, it's a process, and it's not complete anywhere. Certainly in the US, where the structure of colonial domination is completely shrouded in liberal multiculturalism, neoliberal homilies about freedom, colorblind discourse that undergirds criminalization and white supremacy, and certainly that's here in Canada as well, enabling, centuries of state-sanctioned serial murder to continue with impunity. Power cannot be unseated merely through, protest. It's going to take more than that. And finally, Thesis 9 is that, and here I just, this is my tribute, my recognition of the lessons that the great thinker Endowed has taught us, and that is that we have imagined a new world in various ways. The point is to change it. And that means decolonization, which means the end of America and Canada and ultimately the nation state as we know it. Okay, so I'll stop there. I know I went a little bit over, but I'm sure we have much to talk about.
Thank you, Robin, Professor Kelley. I'll just read one comment and then I'll pose a few questions for you that took place in the chat. Somebody, an anonymous attendee, said the reparations movement at ASIL URI last month took pains to demonstrate that transatlantic chattel slavery was not valid under international, even at the time it was taking place. And again, of course, that speaks to the historicization of what you've done, which is to break up the notion of, and in some ways disable the notion of reconciliation or disturb it anyway. And perhaps we can come back to that a little later. Both the actual statement itself, but how that feeds into, in some sense, the historiography of the discourse of reparations itself, which has, of course, a long language, both about chattel slavery, but also, of course, more broadly about reparational justice and so on in its different ways. So perhaps you can comment on that
Yes.
in a little while.
Yes.
The question was by Amaline. Well, perhaps you can go ahead with that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll go real quickly. I mean, it's true, it wasn't valid, but the irony, of course, is that it could not be valid and still be legal. And
Right.
of course, there's ways in which one could argue that post-1807 or post-1808, that the transatlantic slave trade ceased to be legal at that point because some kind of entity somewhere in the world proclaimed it was illegal. And so part of making the point that it's not valid is that if we refuse to recognize European produced international regimes of law, then I completely agree with that. It's not valid, it's not legal by any stretch of the imagination because there are other laws in the world. But part of my point is that liberalism sometimes is seen as the answer to fix it. As like, here the liberals saying, oh, no, look, we have these great cases, legal cases, Somerset, for example, where the legal structure saying that this is not a legal practice, and yet it's ongoing. And it's ongoing in part because it's actually enshrouded in even the U.S. Constitution and other constitutions. That's the other thing, is that you have some kind of international regime of law, and yet still the truth of the matter is that 1807 did not do anything to end slavery. Ultimately, certainly not in North America and not in the Caribbean. and then even 1834, in much of the Western Hemisphere did nothing to end it, because there is no international law. There's the law of capital.
Right. Okay, thank you. Marlene Rosas asked a question: why do you think it's important to talk about this movement to end exploitation's reparations movement? I kind of think you've answered this question, but you might nonetheless elaborate a bit more. She says that reparations has historically been understood and enacted as material compensation. Don't you think Black people in the US are owed monetary compensation first and foremost, so long as they live within a capitalist system? And, quote unquote, also the structural change that other dispossessed people struggle for. I'm sorry it's a long question,
Oh, no.
it does cover many of the questions you've posed for yourself already, I think.
Okay. No, it's a great question, and it's a very difficult one, because on the one hand, I mean, I can't sit here and honestly say that I oppose either the federal government or corporations, universities giving money to Black people. Right? Obviously, that's not a bad thing. But what happens when that giving the money, and I actually didn't address this in the talk, I should have. See, when you take the money, first of all, two things. When you can actually run a algorithm or computer program that would determine value of what it means to be kidnapped, underfed, beaten, forced to labor, bear children, have those children taken from you, and die at 33 years old, like, how do you calculate that? Number one. So it's incalculable. I mean, Frederick Douglass said that. Other people said it. But let's say that there's the money there to be gotten. What happens when you take the money? Part of reparations, the way it's formulated in a liberal capitalist context, is that this ends the conversation. We're not talking about a kind of a truth and reconciliation process, which itself is problematic, because truth and reconciliation in South Africa has also ended the conversation in many ways. But once you take the money and you end the conversation, then you have nothing else to say. Number one, that's one thing. You have not you. It's a way to shut down a critique and ongoing catastrophe. So the consequences of slavery is still with us. And what doesn't change is the way property values property values are racialized. It doesn't make segregation de facto and go away. It doesn't radically shift the way capital reproduces racial difference or operates differentially. Capitalism is not going to do that on its own. And reparations doesn't actually do that. I'm for it. So what my thing is that if we can think about reparations as a social movement, as a way to bankrupt, on the one hand, certain capitalist institutions, but fund the complete reorganization of our lives through funding struggles to overthrow capitalism, overthrow settler colonialism on the one hand. And if we can think of, and I think CARICOM is trying to do this, think about reparations not as individual payments per se, but as massive investments in infrastructure and social life. But those massive investments can't be determined by a state or by a political class when people themselves on the ground have to determine what to do with it. And this is not the same as reparations, but imagine post-Katrina, there was an infusion of money as a result of federal governments and some charity money, but federal government funding. The people were demanding the right to determine what to do with that money. They were demanding things like, we want reconstruction laborers to have a living wage and unionized wages. They didn't get any of that stuff because they had no control over it. Instead, they were supposed to be grateful that they were basically going to use the money to displace and dispossess them, to destroy public housing and replace it with privatized middle and higher income housing. I mean, that was the end result. So I could see that there's a way in which the structure of the way that reparations is talked about, especially given the new trend to say that the only people who deserve it are the people who can prove that they are direct descendants of slaves, as if the regime of slavery produced those kinds of documents because, what they produced were like not names, not even, not even like a recognition of our humanity and our place in our history and our genealogy. So most people don't even have the resources to prove it. But still, the fact that there's a movement afoot on the part of some Black people in the United States to say only those of us who could prove it should get reparations. Yes, the rest of you all shouldn't. And all these immigrants who are coming to the United States from the Caribbean, that they have no right to reparations, So it's all fraud. I mean, if people had a kind of clear understanding of what it means to transform as opposed to reproduce the same system, then I would be less skeptical, but I'm still not against reparations. I'm like reparations in order to build a movement to revolutionize our lives and end racial capitalism and settler colonialism as we know it.
Okay, Robin, there are a number of questions, and I'm going to try to combine some which are proximate to each other, if not necessarily all the same. But one question comes from our colleague Incapable, who talks about, given your critique of the neocolonial state, what role do you see for a decolonized state or the state as the very problem? And if so, do we work without a state, right? So I think, it's an important question because many of us grapple with the idea of, compensation through various kinds of neoliberal states in whatever guise they are, whether they are of the so-called developed or the less developed world, to coin an old-fashioned phrase, right? So, and I mean, I think you've addressed this to a certain extent, and you've touched in some way upon some of that Mamdani has addressed in terms of the problem of particularly of settler states. But there's a broader issue, particularly when it's about the colonial state or the neo-colonial state. How might you address that? There are other comments on the transatlantic slave trade for Brazil, continued to 850. Be careful of the Anglo perspective, that from Afua Cooper. And there are broader questions around, you being the political pundit and trying to, not pundit, but rather more how you would see a movement that in some ways would address the issue in relation to trade union syndicates and so on. I mean, that's a lot to take on here, but if you could perhaps, address some of these things.
Right. Well, let me just say, just before I take on the question of the state, that I said from the outset that I have no, I make no claims for comprehensiveness. And so I'm touching on just a slice of some of these struggles. And yes, we should talk about Brazil. We should talk about Colombia. We should talk about the whole Southern Cone. We should talk about East Africa. We should talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade. We should talk about the Mediterranean. There's lots of things that we really need to think about. I mean, and that's just slavery. In fact, my argument is that slavery is just one modality of forms of exploitation, which, is why I talked about colonialism itself as also a place where you can think about reparations. So in other words, we're talking about the whole world. And it's just huge. So I'm only here to suggest that here's a few little issues that we might be able to think about. Now, to go back to the question of the state, it's a very difficult one because, so-called post-colonial nations have inherited the colonial state. And the colonial state has been, was seen initially in the post-World War II period as the potential vehicle for a new kind of social democratic, if not socialist, welfare state that could ensure, a strong trade union, strong wages, the end of precarity, housing, all these things. That was the dream of the kind of post-colonial moment that Vijay Prashad talks about in his writing, but that's not the outcome because the colonial state was never dismantled. The colonial state was designed to extract taxes, to use its military might to control populations, to compel people to work, and to be a source of wealth itself in nation states and post-colonial nation states that are still colonial in a sense, but nation states with limited resources as a result of the way the global economy is structured. And so taking money from the state itself, the state coffers, has become one way of producing new classes, of ruling classes. So that's to say that we can't make a leap to suddenly say we don't recognize the states need to be dismantled. It's a process. I don't have an answer to how that process is going to take place, but I do know that that if we're going to talk about the transfer of resources to people in need, in the name of reparations, on the path to decolonization, that there may be a way in which new forms of organization should be the recipients of those resources, not the state, in spite of the state. And what the state has at its disposal, even the poorest state, is a monopoly on violence, right? And that monopoly on violence is often used to control or suppress any opposition to state power. And so I think about, we had Lisa Trotz in our seminar today, and one of the organizations that she works with and I work with is Red Thread. I mean, imagine if organizations like Red Thread had all the resources, not the state, to determine how to distribute those resources, how to care for people, how to create new forms of housing to end precarity. I mean, people have the capacity to do those things, but it requires doing more than just dismantling the state apparatus, which means dismantling militaries and police forces, come up with new forms of public safety, and basically dismantle through a process of decolonization, which is to recognize the people as sovereign, as opposed to just the state as representing sovereignty. So I can't speak to the whole world because I don't know the whole world, but I do know one thing. Living in Turtle Island, I would much rather be under indigenous sovereignty than the U.S. state that we're dealing with right now. Like, I'd give it that in a second, in a second. But I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying we have to try to imagine something different other than the state as the solution. And here in the U.S., the state is almost always seen by so many Black people as if we get the Democrats in power, they're our friends, they're the good people, especially the federal government as opposed to state governments, and it's ridiculous. But that's what we've inherited.
Thank you, Robin. I have to apologize in advance for many people who have posed questions here. I've tried to do these questions in as much order as we can, and we really do only have a few minutes left. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to ask Robin to read out questions that came out earlier on, which I haven't had an opportunity to pose for him. And then I'm just going to identify the questions in a kind of acknowledgement of the people who've asked these questions subsequently. So Gaurav Jashnani had asked Robin, you offered a brief but compelling critiques of reparations at Georgetown and in Evanston. What forms would a liberatory program of reparations take, or what could anti-racial capitalist reparations look like? So, again, it's asking you to be like a consultant on reparations in a progressive way, but nonetheless, if you could pose that. There's also an interesting question by David Austin saying there's a tension between the call and energy invested in the struggle for reparation and the need to focus on Black self-organization. And to what extent does reparation presume a Euro-Western culture fail to live up to its ideals of freedom, when in fact it does not and cannot recognize the injury in the first instance? I partially think you've answered that, but perhaps you might want to address that. And then there's also by Shaila Wadwani, who says, thank you for the presentation that centers on life and living in the afterlife so much as death and devastation. Can you say more about the life ways that can be nurtured in this new ethics of care? There's questions by Leon Elcock. I'm sorry, Leon, I don't know if we have enough time. There's one by Rhoda Ruddick about the liberal state and developmental social democratic states. There's one by by Ronaldo with regards to the Caribbean bourgeoisie and American elites. And there's also a question, I think, which came up earlier, which can you actually identify an actually existing example of blues time? But, which, one can riff off. I like Black and Crazy Blues, but that's another matter, right? So anyway, if you could, I know that's a lot, Robin.
Okay, so I actually see the question, so I'll just try to answer all of them.
Okay, sure. Okay,
which is why, and one of the things I should say is that most of these questions, if anyone can answer them, I'm like, that's amazing. But let me just begin with Gaurav. So, in terms of what forms would liberatory programs for reparations take, I mean, that's not for me to decide. I can't decide that. And by the way, I'm not a soothsayer or pundit, but I can say that one of the reasons I wrote that chapter in Freedom Dreams was to talk about one's examples of programs or proposals, I should say, that actually were liberatory. And with the thing that they all had in common was, whether it's in Cobra, Republic of New Africa, and certainly there's examples in the Caribbean and ARM. What a lot of those programs had in common was that they wanted resources for movement building. And so it wasn't resources necessarily for capitalization. Movement building and cultural institutions. And so the idea was that the ongoing struggle for liberation is what would be funded. And certainly Queen Mother Moore was asking for $500 trillion, like a lot of money that would basically break the whole world of capitalism, if it were even allowed. But her thing still was about building movements. And let's see, we go down to David. Oh, there was one before David. So is it the one that said that ends afraid to reimagine an experiment? Is that the one? Okay. Mm-hmm. So this is true. A lot of people are not willing to sacrifice their wealth, equity for collective good. Self-preservation takes precedence. How can we possibly move forward if people are afraid of the unknown? Well, the only way to move forward is to jump into the unknown and be afraid. And I think that capitalism itself, racial capitalism is, as everybody knows, is a superstructure. It's an ideology. It is exactly why the answer to your question is exactly why much of the discourse around reparations is about capital accumulation. How can we build businesses and own homes and be wealthy too? And so it's hard to imagine a way forward that make us rethink, even private property, even the idea of sharing. But I think that there's ways forward that in practice, in social movement practice, that people are trying to figure that out. And it's not like there aren't precedents. There's precedents in communal living and experiments in trying to figure out a way of an ethics of care that puts property and things as secondary to connection. So all I could say is that we have to reimagine and have to experiment. And no movement in the history of the world, as I know of, has ever involved the majority of the people anywhere. So, we always begin where we begin. So David's question, tension between the call and energy invested in struggle for reparation and the need to focus on Black self-organization. And to what extent does reparation presume the Euro-Western culture failed to live up to its ideals? I think that's a really important point, when in fact, it cannot recognize the injury in the first place. I just totally agree. There's nothing else to say that this is absolutely right. And this is one of the limits of the reparations discourse. It's not everyone's reparations discourse, but there is a discourse that does presume that this is a promise, that the promise is somehow embedded. This is like the Gunnar Myrdal interpretation of of the West, that there's a promise creed that has been unfulfilled, and that the paycheck that Dr. King talks about is the fulfillment of that promise. When in fact, to think about decolonization is to say that was never the promise, ever. And that what we need to do is blow up the systems we have now and replace it with something completely different to decolonize. That the intention of liberalism, the intention of the bourgeois democratic revolutions was never the extension of freedom to all. It was always about the transformation of property and people into capital. And that's what liberty means. Okay, I know that we're running over time.
We kind of it's partly not to tax you, but also that we have a few announcements, and I really do want, or we would like to acknowledge all the people who have made contributions and comments, as well as, and maybe this gets back to Blues time rather than linear time, and
That's
find
right.
a way of enacting. Yeah.
Right. Well, I just want to acknowledge the great questions and comments by Rhoda Reddick and Ronaldo Walcott, and both I agree with. I mean, I basically with the basic premises behind it. And as far as blues time, the simplest answer to that is if we can imagine if a song like the International was a blues, it wouldn't necessarily have an ending. It would have a continuation of verses and would never return back to the beginning. But even if it feels cyclical, it goes back to someplace else that we haven't been. And so in Nick Estey's book, I think is one of the best examples of Indigenous time and blues time laid out in a history in which the past, and I would say this also about, I'll leave it with Nick's book, but it's one of the best books that really capture the fact that past, present, future are often lived. You know, the struggles that Black women in Guyana, for example, are engaged in to create a new future and carry the past with them as they're living in the present to solve the immediate problems. That's blues time in action. That's blues time in action to me. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Okay. Well, listen, there are no remains at all, Robin, but if we can just say on behalf of everyone who participated, especially the audience and the organizers, thank you for this extraordinary, rich, layered talk, engagement, and commentary with the issue of reparations and decolonization. So on behalf of everybody, a really, really big thank you on behalf of everyone who was here and those who wanted to be here but weren't able to be so. Maybe we can also call it monk time, but anyway. But thank you so much. Okay, thank you. I just have one more message to give out about the next coming talk, which is this is the International Political Economy and Ecology Summer School live lecture series for the 30th anniversary. It's called Freedom Dreams, Visualizing Freedoms, which is on Thursday, July the 8th. And it's Robin Kelley in conversation with John Anglofa, Bushra Junaid, and moderated by Julie Cooks. This is in collaboration with the Art Gallery of Ontario. So we're being encouraged to everyone to participate in that. And once again, Robin, thank you so much for the talk today. And we'll hope to have another engagement with you another time. Thank you.
Thank you.